For men were not meant to live lives dazzled by day's light, nor blinded by night's darkness. We are born, we strive, we expire and are forgotten. Save those few who do daring deeds in that land that lies between light and shadow. Mazal ibn Rakamim. Hello. Welcome to a project of mine I'm calling the Umbral Aeons. And don't let that bastardization of Greek and Latin throw you off. Have you noticed that in the realm of fantasy, things are becoming a bit formulaic? A hero is presented to you that is not accepted by the outside world, nor by his home kin. He goes on a hero's journey, finds a magic item or learns a magic power, returns, defeats a big bad bugaboo who's threatening the world. Everyone lives happily ever after. It's very fairy tale. It's very Victorian. It's very bad writing. It's not that I hold anything against high fantasy. I started by reading high fantasy. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. I realize some people say that's not high fantasy. It's more allegorical, but no, it's high fantasy. You're mentioning the great Greek myths. You're coming up with a whole world design. Magic is prevalent in almost every novel. J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Weiss and Hickman's Dragonlance. R.A. Salvatore's basically founding the Forgotten Realms. Even though I know Jeff Grubb and what's his name? The guy that wrote Elminster, Ed Greenwood, had a lot more to do with the setting and the stories. But let's face it, we all ended up reading Forgotten Realms because of Drizzt Do'Urden. High fantasy can be rewarding. But let's not sugarcoat it. It's hard to feel an emotional attachment to these characters sometimes. You don't feel the same way about Drizzt Do'Urden as you do, say, Solomon Kane. You don't admire Gandalf the way you do, say, Conan the Barbarian. And you don't want to spend time with Tanis or Goldmoon the way that you'd love to sit down and go drinking with Red Sonja. Why is that? Well, I think I have an answer. High fantasy is meant to aspire. It is fantasy meant to be essentially a staring at the sun. Virtue and nobility and awe are the currency of that fiction. They try to sell you on the heroic ideal by only seeing the bright points. Now, there is the reverse in fiction. Again, I love this author too, and authors like him. H.P. Lovecraft's characters that delve into darkness and discover things man was not meant to know and have to wrestle with the insignificance of man in the face of death in an uncaring universe. Clark Anton Smith, other people who wrote in that vein, Algernon Blackwood, Clive Barker, especially the original Hellbound Heart novelette. These authors present a fantastic fiction that is dark and grimy and not comforting, and when you confront it, you must accept the fact that everything you do has no meaning and you're ultimately damned to failure. You might as well go out and eat, drink, and be merry and take the hedonistic path, or descend into darkness and become corrupt to get power while you're alive. It's really oogie stuff. It also has a problem. You don't relate to, say, Randolph Carter the way you do to Cull. You don't admire Harry Dresden, because, I'm sorry, the Dresden Files got a lot of Cthulian stuff to them. You don't admire Harry Dresden the way you admire, say, Brule, Cull's friend, the Pict. Why is that? Well, I think it's because that cosmic horror and fiction that feeds into that nihilistic view, such as certain crime fiction, it tries to sell you with a currency of vice and hopelessness and depravity. But that's not the entirety of the human experience either. Robert Irvin Howard only wrote 20 Conan stories. I think about 20. I'd have to have my notes in front of me. He wrote very little of Conan, actually, when you stop and look at it. And yet, the character had such an impact that pastiche authors have not stopped writing him ever since. Ever since Howard wrote Conan, someone else has been writing a Conan story. Even if it's, God help us, Marvel Comics. But we owe them. We owe all these pastiche authors. Robert Jordan, John Maddox Roberts, Lynn Carter, Bjorn Nyberg, L'Esprit de Camp, Marvel Comics. I mean, as much as I have some issues with what Marvel Comics did, some of their illustrations, they're the way I see Conan now for the rest of my days. And I think it's because when you're dealing with a character like Conan, who's a thief and a brigand, who would knife opponent in the back, who would steal from a man, but wouldn't take his water if he's in a desert, wouldn't steal food from a babe, wouldn't savage a woman. You have someone that's much more like us. Heroic fantasy, sometimes called sword and sorcery or sword and sandal, doesn't completely embrace the light, nor does it completely embrace the darkness. They are stories that are much more firmly grounded in human psychology and inspired by human culture. You can see rough analogies to historical people and historical cultures all throughout heroic fantasy. They're often lacking from high fantasy or even from cosmic horror. The reactions of people in heroic fantasy are much more understandable to us. When a betrayal happens in high fantasy, you can explain away as magic or plot armor or something of that nature. When it happens in heroic fantasy, you feel it. And likewise, when someone is loyal in heroic fantasy, when they should have every reason to descend into darkness and depravity, you feel it. And that's what's inspired Umbral Aeons. Because those of us that love heroic fantasy want a world to write on, but often because the appeal of such worlds is not easily marketable. We write a few stories and then we stop. Writing a consistent world, that can be quite a chore just in of itself, much less writing stories about your hero. And if you try to write upon a historical world of a certain era, then you have problems of having to try to mix and match your verisimilitude and your knowledge of the historical period to that of making the yarn consistent with heroic fantasy's slight embrace of wonder and fantasy. So what do we do? Well, Umbral Aeons was constructed so that we could get around these issues, as well as a more telling one in our present world: copyright. Try publishing a Hyborian story without the permission of Conan properties. Watch what happens. Umbral Aeons has a world which I have drawn out roughly with a map and put various cultures upon that are the main, and I do stress main, cultures of the planet. That's large enough for you to make up your own little subcultures and your own little places of interest. It is a place where all of our heroes can wander, and in that sword and sorcery milieu, we can write tales for one another. To pass the time, entertain one another, and perfect our writing. I hate to harp on it, but I really like this genre. It is fantasy meets film noir. It is a type of genre in which when a hero does something that may at first detest me or seem reprehensible, later in the story he'll do something that'll win me back. And isn't that the experience we have in our everyday lives with everyone else? The planet's called Umbral, and I will be describing to you in this audio record, as well as in the package you can see on the site and on our Facebook page. Yes, I'm an old fogey, I use Facebook. What the writing restrictions are for the world. The biggest one for writing a story is don't write any One Ring scenarios. There is no save the world missions in this fiction. There are no magical rites that are going to destroy the world a la Buffy the Vampire Slayer. No. This is a place, I don't want to say for lower key adventures, but it's a place for more plausible ones, if that makes sense. That's not to say there aren't magicians running around summoning demons out of the aether, and there aren't magical spells. But magicians typically don't cast lightning. They don't summon up fireballs. They're much more inclined, like most swords and sorcery magicians, to lay a curse on you or give you a prophetic dream. Or if they do have to do the aforementioned lightning bolt and fire, it's usually a lot cheaper to get a demon to do it for you. The gods aren't apparently active. If they are, it's typically by giving someone a quest or a dream, hey, go do this. And the priests, well, they seem to have a lock on who can talk to the god and how the god will talk to you, so take that for what it's worth. They seem surprisingly lacking in divine miracles, though, but they'll certainly take your cold. Kings make petty war. Women are, well, women are women. Raving barbarians are at the edges of the known world, and monsters do exist, but hidden places of the earth or in lands unexplored just off the map. Authors that write in this vein are the aforementioned Robert Irvin Howard, Elspring de Camp, Bren Nyberg. I forget who wrote the Death Dealer novels that were inspired by Frank Frazetta's paintings, but Gatha Ball would be a good example of this kind of fiction. Lynn Carter, I hope that's a good starting point. That's the only people coming out to the tip of my mind right now. And I think this fiction can have wide appeal. If you look at the most popular fantasy series right now in the world, at the time that I record this, October the 2nd, 2020, it's A Song of Fire and Ice by George R.R. Martin. And although that world definitely has high fantasy elements, at its heart, it's essentially heroic fantasy. It's gritty. Human motivation and human psychology is the bulk of what moves the story. Skullduggery and daring deeds go hand in hand, and what virtue there is, it's hard won, and it often requires sacrifice. Yes, you can be a good, noble person on the world of fire and ice, but it's going to cost you, just like real life. That tends to me to be the hallmark of heroic fantasy. The good guy can ride off into the sunset, but it's not going to be easy. I hope you like the project. I hope you'll join us. And with that, let's go to the next video.